Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia. Each week we interview experts to talk about parts of the sustainable transition and what you and your business need to know to succeed.
Sustainability is complex and constantly evolving, and it can be hard for a business to adapt and remain competitive.
We are here to help you learn all about the changing economy and the ongoing transition.
So join us as we explore the concepts and the tools you need to plot a course for a sustainable future.
To a new episode of Shaken Not Burned. I'm your host, Giulia. There is no denying that continuing to treat the natural world as we do will lead to ecological breakdown. We don't seem to take into account how our consumption of natural resources affects the planet, which ultimately may stop providing those resources in the first place. So how can we start living within planetary and social boundaries that will allow us to thrive? Economist Kate Raworth has developed a model called Doughnut Economics, which we will discuss in today's episode with Carolina Eboli and Joe Woods at the London Doughnut Economy Coalition. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Lovely to be with you, Giulia.
Pleasure to be here, Giulia.
Can you tell me more about the purpose of the London Doughnut Economy Coalition and your roles in it? I'm aware it's volunteer work that you do, so it'd be interesting to know how you got into this.
If people ask me about the coalition and how I got involved, I usually start talking about my professional background and how those things link. And when I was reflecting on how I would explain how I got into this today, I was really thinking about, I never really had a formal education in economics, and I never really thought I'd be working or doing any volunteer work in that respect. So maybe it's worth spending a bit of time here just telling you about my personal journey.
Of course.
So you can bear with me for a minute. I'm originally from Brazil. I grew up in a city called Belo Horizonte. Is in the southeast of Brazil, and it means beautiful horizon, which is quite poetic. And the interesting thing is that it's a planned city, and Europe has really old cities, and it's really hard to find a city that was completely planned from scratch. But at the same time, in the 18th century, that colonial capital of the region of that part of Brazil didn't really have enough infrastructure and didn't have space to grow. So it was kind of tucked between the mountains, and they needed space to grow. It was a mining area. So they planned this new capital. It was inaugurated in 1897, and it was done in 5 years. It's really remarkable.
Yeah.
So the original plan, which had two different areas, it had a core area, which was the urban area, which was 9 square kilometers. Quite small. And it had this kind of very rational grid with even sized blocks, some diagonals, all kind of wrap around this ring road, which was meant to be the core of the city. And there's nothing really surprising about any of this, because this plan was following the very much European and American urban planning trends at the time. But the interesting thing is that it also marked on the map the suburban area. So you had this kind of very rigid urban core, but you had this more flexible area, which didn't really have a lot of planning, didn't have any grids, any roads, and it was the area to grow. And, it was a transition zone between urban and more rural areas. And the idea was that also had a boundary. They never thought the city was going to grow indefinitely. So when the city was 70 years old, they had 1 million inhabitants already. And just to put this into perspective, the planners had envisaged that the city would get to 100,000 in 100 years. So we were at 1 million at 72 years old. So, quite a big difference there. And now it has 120 years old. The city has about 2.3 million people and occupy an area of 330 square kilometers, which is 36 times the original urban core. Now it's the 6th largest city in Brazil. And I'm not even talking about the metropolitan area of Belo Horizonte, which is more than double all of those numbers that I said. And I'm telling you all of this kind of unsolicited urban history just because I feel like it not only represents the scale of the challenge that we're up against when we start talking about growth as a society, but I also it is also how I started to get interested in how cities are organized and for who they're organized. So my starting point in this journey was very much from an urban perspective and looking at cities as living organisms. Cities are like people. They need inputs, they need materials, they need resources. They get metabolized in our industries, our businesses, or in our houses. And all of those things also produce waste, things that the body kind of rejects once it's consumed all the food, all the inputs. So when you start thinking about cities in that way, you start to realize, well, wait a minute, why am I wasting so much? It's a really big effort to do all of this mining, to transport these materials, to process these resources, and not to consume them in their entireties. I feel like I'm rejecting way more than what I consume. And to give a different perspective, it's like ordering food in a restaurant. We don't really think about it, but it takes a really big effort to have that plate served to you. First of all the ingredients needed to be farmed, cultivated for months, using water, using nutrients, machinery to harvest them, all the sorts. Then they were transported, some of them maybe directly to the restaurant or the place where they're going to be sold. Maybe others had to be further processed to an industry to then use more water, more energy, more materials. Then they need to be packaged, then transported again. Maybe they will finally get to that restaurant. And then at that point, it still needs to be cooked. And it still needs human resources and other resources to be able to do that. And every step of that way, there is waste. And when you get your food, that beautiful plate, perfectly cooked, if you don't eat it all, that still goes to the bin. And then that will probably get incinerated and go to a landfill. And it will never be seen again in nature. So there's a lot going on in those systems. And it's not even the natural resources that is the only thing being wasted here. It's also the human resources, the labor of that entire supply chain. And that's when maybe circularity enters the room. For me, this circular economy is one of the most powerful ways to capture that potential. And that concept has been ongoing for a while now. But I also think it's a very hard one to go against, No one is going to say, well, I don't really think that we would be better off if we wasted less, if we reduce our waste. It's pretty straightforward. It's really hard to do, but no one is really going to go against that. But when you start to unpack it, you kind of understand the complexities about all of those systems. And, there are a lot of brilliant people out there talking about circular economy, exploring what that means, like Ellen MacArthur Foundation or other players in this space, identifying, the barriers and different ways to achieve it. And it's all about creativity and innovation and looking at nature as inspiration to solve some of the difficult problems that we have. Also about creating networks and collaboration. Kind of a beautiful thing. And kind of going back to doughnut economics, it's kind of one of the things that most resonated with me was that concept of being regenerative, which for me is all about circularity. And I think the beauty of doughnut economics is that it adds two additional really important layers, which is the social to complement the ecological and the global to complement the local. We can talk a bit more about this kind of global lens because I don't think that gets discussed enough. I really think it's easier for us to talk about these things in our local context because that's what's easier to kind of relate to, is kind of what we care about. It's what we can see that affects us directly. But everything is so intertwined that we have all of these supply chains and financial systems. And I don't think we get to pretend that we live in our local bubble. But even if I start unpacking this, if we go back to that example of the restaurant, those fruits, vegetables, they were most likely not farmed in London. If we're lucky, they're from Spain or somewhere in Europe, but most certainly some of that will be from Africa or South America, including places like Brazil. So it's like a bit of a Pandora box of thinking about all of those kind of global systems and how we need to kind of start talking about our responsibility towards not only the environments and the communities. And the doughnut really help us to start looking into those things. So I think with all of that, is a really long answer to your question. It's all of those things that combined made me so interested about doughnut economics. And I started to really kind of delve into that world and learn a bit more about it. And I got in contact with someone that was part of the group through my day job. And I then joined the Well, it wasn't even a coalition at the time. It was just a bit of a group of volunteers just trying to see what we could do that was related to London. And slowly with time, we kind of self-organized, if you like. And I think one of the first things that I helped to develop as part of this group was what we call the city portrait for London, which is, we can get into it a bit more, but which is a way to kind of look at the city from those four lenses. So from the social, ecological, but also the local and the global. And then slowly we kind of started to evolve this group, and we are now a constituted community interest company, and I'm one of the directors, part of the board, so trying to kind of see where we can take this. But all of this has always been volunteer work.
Amazing. Well done. A really interesting story, and yeah, so great that someone dedicates their free time to it. So Jo, what about you? What brought you to the donut economics world? And what's your role in the coalition?
Yeah, that was fascinating. So yeah, my background's a little bit different. I've worked in business for most of my professional life, in publishing, paid publishing, selling books to the general public, and specifically in international sales. And a few years ago, I was just starting to question a little bit what I was doing and why I was doing it, and what we were doing as a business, and why we were doing it. I'm sort of thinking a little more broadly about impact on the world or impact on society. And I went to a conference in Brighton, a conference that was about doing better business called Meaning. I hadn't heard of donut economics at the time, and I saw Kate Raworth speak. So it's the very first time I saw Kate Raworth speak. I'd heard about donut economics. And within the first few minutes of her talk, I was blown away. It was just like a light bulb coming on. She's an amazing speaker, but it was the first time I'd heard the kind of the social angle or the social lens as well as the ecological lens sort of presented. And that just made such sense to me, sort of that both are important, sort of how we are as human beings and the lives that we're leading and what we need to lead sort of thriving lives are as important as the world we live in, and sort of the planet that sustains us. So that just made perfect sense to me. And I had a question immediately afterwards was, how can I apply this? How can I apply donut economics to my work in business? That was in 2017. And so it's something I've been looking into, exploring in different ways ever since. So I, similar to Carolina, I joined that sort of very initial group of volunteers in London. I think our first call was in October 2020, lockdown time. And I've been sort of a part of it and stepped back a little bit sort of ever since. And then just very recently joined the board along with Carolina in April this year. My particular interest in donut economics is sort of how can we apply it to business? How can we bring the principles of donut economics to life in businesses in London?
Amazing. So we've got sort of the urban view and the business view, which is really interesting. And I suppose they complement each other quite well. So before we delve into what the coalition does and how you can promote the cause, why don't we get into what donut economics means and Kate Raworth's theories? Who would like to start?
Do you want to go first, Carolina?
Yeah, absolutely. Giulia, you already mentioned donut economics. It was a framework developed by the economist Kate Raworth, and it really reimagines how we think about economic success. So it's visualized as a donut, but the American version with the hole in the middle. And you have the inner ring, which represents the social foundation. This means it's everything that a person should have access to, like housing, education, healthcare, but other things like political voice, access to culture. And they all derive from the Sustainable Development Goals defined by the United Nations. Then we have the outer ring, which is the ecological ceiling. Sometimes we refer that as planetary boundaries. Those are the things that we shouldn't overshoot. They are the things that kind of dictate the health of our planet. So they include things like climate change, but also biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, waste and conversion. And these things are derived from the earth scientists, and they can be measured. So the safe and just space for humanity lies in between those two rings. That's where everyone's needs are met without breaching the Earth's limits. So it really challenges the idea that more growth is always better, and instead asks, how do we thrive in balance? And to help to answer some of those questions, DEAL, which is the Doughnut Economy Action Lab, which was created to help put Kate's idea into action, they have been putting a lot of effort over the years to develop tools, to bring communities, businesses, organizations interested in doughnut economics to evolve this concept. And they have evolved it over time, I think, as well as a concept. And one of the most helpful tools was something that I was mentioning before, which is the city portrait. And it can be applied to any place, really. It doesn't have to be a city. We are now, as a coalition, we are exploring how it can be applied in a neighborhood scale. But that's how they found a way to unroll the donuts. That's how they call it. It is essentially kind of building that matrix where you have the ecological ceiling on top and the social foundation at the bottom. And then in between, you have the local and global perspective. So in the end, you are always looking at those dimensions from both perspectives. So you'll be asking questions such as, how can this place be as generous as the wildland next door? But at the same time, also asking, how can this place respect the health of the whole planet? And then from a social perspective, you'd be asking questions like, how can all people in this place thrive? At the same time, they're asking, how can this place respect the well-being of everyone in the planet? So it kind of brings that additional complexity into the discussions, which helps to push us just a bit outside of the superficial. And then underlying all of this, there are some principles that support this, like being regenerative, being distributive, and so on. Those things are overarching. But with time, doughnut economics has evolved as well. There are different coalitions, groups all over the world exploring what that means for their place. Every place is different. There is no specific output that needs to come out of this process. So it gives you enough flexibility to explore, convey people around these themes, but it gives you the freedom to see what that looks like without putting too much restraint as well.
Interesting. Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you if there are many similarities when you're looking from the urban context. The portrait that you did of London, could it be applied, for example, to your hometown of Belo Horizonte?
As in, the portrait of London would be exactly the same as the portrait of Belo Horizonte?
No,
or just the methodology?
If in general there are similarities when addressing doughnut economics from a city perspective, or if every city is so unique that you can't do that at all.
Well, I think the point of doughnut economics is that we would find the particularities of that place through that lenses. So while there might be similarities, I think every portrait would be very different as well. And that's also the beauty of it, isn't it? Because you would be able to see how every place is so unique. The University of Leeds, a while ago, actually quite early on after Kate's published her book, they have done the calculations for all the countries in the world for their ecological ceiling. So you can find out how everyone is doing in relation to their planetary boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And no one's doing very well, the spoiler alert. But the interesting thing is that you pick up some trends that you wouldn't otherwise, or you see how maybe generally speaking, Europe is overconsumption and all of those things, but you might see the differences in relation to all of those boundaries between the countries as well. So it will allow you to see the uniqueness, and both in terms of the good and also the bad. So you can apply the methodology anywhere, but the outputs will always be very different. And this is a more data-driven exercise, which in the end acknowledge that a city portrait would be composed of a data element, so the evidence, the things that we can measure, the things that are out there, and not everything we can measure, and they acknowledge that barrier as well, together with a community portrait, which is all about the stories and the people and how people perceive these dimensions as well. And those things can complement each other. Because if you're only looking from a data perspective, you would also not see the full picture. And if you only see it from the community perspective, you might miss out some of those kind of important elements that would give you more grounding and more evidence to kind of act on certain topics. So the combination of the two is probably the ideal world, but not always that can happen. Certainly when we were doing the London portrait, we did a data portrait. We didn't really do a combined data and community portrait because as a coalition, we didn't really have the resources or capacity to undertake that. So we acknowledge our limitations in that respect. And in London, we were even thinking about, well, how would be a city portrait for London? Do we do one for the whole London? Do we do one per borough? There's just so many complexities in London as well. So it just became, okay, well, I don't think we have the ability to do 33 portraits. So maybe let's just stick to one for now and then see how that kind of develops.
Are you planning to bring in the community aspect of it at some point?
Yes. So we are, at the moment, one of the things that we are developing is a neighborhood pilot, which is all about testing that methodology from the community perspective. So the idea is that we would see how the donor economics framework would kind of flourish in a smaller scale. We are not the pioneers of this. Civic Square, they have done this brilliantly in Birmingham. And they have documented this very well. It's really very inspiring, the work that they've done. And we don't have maybe the amount of time or resources to kind of take it to that same level. But we are doing our own version in the south of London. So we are exploring what that would mean for both two areas in London. One is Brixton area and the other one is an area around Old Kent Road. We've been having a lot of discussions, relationship building with the communities on both of those locations for the past 6 months, and kind of introducing what donor economic is and, seeing if they would be interested, because we don't want obviously to impose this on anyone. And it has really grown into the group. It's really nice to see that they see donor economics as something that they want to explore. So we've been doing those two things in parallel, those two places in parallel. And actually this Saturday, we just had a big event in Old Kent Road area where we gather lots of community groups, and we kind of blended with a street party that was already going to happen. So there was a lot of the community already there, but we put a donut spin to it. There were a lot of questions around donor economics about how people perceive what is important, what are the main things that they want to see, what is, the ecological ceiling, the social foundations, so people can start to engage with these things. And it was really fun. We had some young people in charge of kind of documenting it. And that was mixed with a lot of activities that were maybe donor economic related, but that's okay because that's part of life, right? Our lives are not kind of split into what kind of fits within the box. It's all kind of mixed. It's about the relationships and the connections and what people feel is important. So it was a very fun and a bit soft way to kind of introduce those concepts to the local people. So we are at the start of this journey. We can talk again in 6-8 months and I'll let you know how that went. Hopefully we'll have something really beautiful to kind of share with the rest of the world so we can share that story too.
That's really cool. It's nice to see that people were interested and engaging with it. And from a personal perspective, I live in Brixton, so I'm really looking forward to seeing the results of it. And Jo, why don't we talk about the business side of things? So how the coalition is perhaps working with companies, or if companies are even interested in learning more about doughnut economics.
And it was just coming to mind as just listening to Carolina describe the work that's going on in the neighbourhoods in London, because so for doughnut economics, like from a business perspective, one of the principles, so in Kate Raworth's book, 7 Ways to Think Like a 20th Century Economist, one of the ways is seeing the big picture. And that, for me, just like from my own experience in business, is sort of super important. I kind of learned in business, sort of business is about making money, and the environment, that's over there. And you think about it if you have to, but we're about making money and the social impact and what you're giving back to society, taking from society. So that's over there. And, your focus is on the business, yeah? And the principle about seeing the big picture is that business is not this kind of isolated entity, independent of everything else. Business is part of the economy, and the economy is embedded in society. So the economy is this social system. It's a social construct that we've kind of created together. And then the economy is embedded in society, and society is embedded in the living world. So sort of from a doughnut economics perspective, it's about turning that around. And instead of the living world being in service to society and society being in service to the economy, and businesses as being part of that economy. It's the other way around, so that businesses and the economy should be in service of society and in service of the living world. As Carolina said, we're not these isolated entities and existing independently of the community we live in. We grow up in a community, we work in a community, we live in a community, and we die in a community. That's the whole of life. That perspective is really interesting that I found just coming from that business background is more connections. And that's what's been so fantastic about being part of the coalition. It's bringing all of these different elements together. So that's one perspective in terms of donor economics and business. And then the other two that are super important for businesses is actually about businesses shifting. So shifting from an approach to the world, approach to doing business that is degenerative and divisive. So it's taking, how much financial value can we extract from this? And it's looking at how, instead, being more regenerative and more distributive, so how many benefits can we build into this business? And those are huge questions. Once you start to think about these things more deeply, there are no easy answers. And that is challenging. From what I've seen having conversations with businesses about doughnut economics, it's that in business, there's a bias to action. We want to be able to take a decision. We want to be able to make a plan. We want to have targets and tangible outputs. But I think particularly the moment that we're in right now, taking that time to step back and just ask, what is it that we're doing and how are we doing this? And most importantly, why are we doing this? And that's true for business as well as any other organisation is super important. And the doughnut economics framework offers that to business. So it's more about asking questions and thinking more deeply about what the business is doing. And actually, Erin Zahan, who's been on the podcast, talks about the deep design of business. So actually looking really carefully at, what the purpose of the business is. How is it governed? How are decisions made? Who owns the business and what do they expect of it? What are the business's networks? What are the relationships that it has with its suppliers, with its employees, with its customers? And how is it financed? Where is the finance coming from and what does the finance demand of the business? They're not easy questions to ask, and there are no sort of simple solutions. Very similarly to the kind that Caroline was talking about, sort of at the neighbourhood level, it's about exploring, it's about piloting, and there are many different ways, and sort of business is different, and what they will come up with and how they start to think about these questions and address the problems will be very different.
Thanks, Jo. Yeah, we will link to the episode that we did with Erin in the show notes. So does the coalition work with any local businesses at the moment? Has anyone gotten in touch? What's their interest like?
From a business perspective, we're at the very beginning. We're sort of taking it one step at a time, exploring. I've had a conversation with a business that's in my sector in publishing who have started to look at donor economics in their business. To be completely honest, it's challenging. This is kind of light bulb moment. This really makes sense. This is where we need to be heading. And something the business really valued was having the space to ask these questions and for sort of people from different parts of the business to be discussing these challenges was super valuable. And then priorities come in, whether it's the budget, whether it's sort of crunch time for the business itself, and so things can drift a little bit. So it's about keeping an eye on where we're going in the long term and taking it step by step. Erin said it's sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and it's okay. That's the nature of what we're working with. It feels like it's, on one level, it's very early stages. Different types of businesses will perhaps more like B Corps or social enterprises are already working with a lot of the concepts from doughnut economics. They might not call it doughnut economics or the circular economy or other things. So there's lots going on and it's happening in lots of different ways.
Do you find that there is dialogue between these different movements? You mentioned the B Corp, circular economy. Are people willing to find the common ground?
In my sector, there's the company that I talked about that is looking at doughnut economics. And then there's a similar company that has gone down the B Corp route. Mm-hmm. I'd say they're both kind of aiming at the same end. It's about sort of businesses becoming a force for social environmental good. And how you get there depends on, from what I've seen, sort of the nature of the business, what feels important to them, what feels like perhaps not quite an easy, but sort of a logical next step in terms of where they're up to.
And talking about policy, maybe it's one for Carolina. Do you find that policymakers are interested in discussing donut economics? And also you mentioned earlier global versus local. So I suppose if you are a London policymaker, you want to talk about London, right? You want to attract those voters. So how can we deal with these challenges?
There is definitely interest, I would say, especially at the city and borough level or local authority level, because I think it's where it's really clear, the effects of climate breakdown, they're really tangible at that local scale. And that's why it's much easier to start talking about these concepts from a local perspective. And in London, one of the first things that we did right after we had that city portrait launched, we managed to gather 6 or 7 borough leaders from London. And we, through actually DEO and our contacts with other coalitions all over the world, we got their counterparts of Amsterdam, who has been, a great example of a city that has introduced donor economics in their policies. They were very explicit there. And we brought all of these people together to discuss about donor economics, to share their learnings and the lessons and so on. When you put people in the same room, obviously they were already interested in the topic, but no one really disagreed with any of the principles behind donor economics, which is great. What we found was that sometimes language was a bit of a challenge. That they mentioned something like, is this another framework, another concept, another jargon? Because when you are especially in the built environment or in the planning world, there are always ideas that surface and they pick up a bit of pace, like ESG. And then you hear these kind of words. It's like, what is the right one? Which one should we go for? And I think that's a fair challenge. We as a coalition, we have engaged with people who have seen and said the same thing. When we were engaging this community group at the start, they were like, I'm not sure I like this name. I don't know if it resonates with me. Sometimes the word economy puts people off because they don't feel they are entitled to talk about the economy. So there are nuances there. And obviously London has a very different structure politically and urban planning perspectives from Amsterdam. So it's much harder to get that consistent messaging, even if the principles are somewhat similar. So there's definitely an interest there. And I think is in particular in finding ways to weave some of those concepts into existing strategies that they might already have. So for example, Nuon, they are a great example. Mayor Roxana Fias, she was really interested in donut economics. She even joined our panel when we did the first Global Donut Day event in 2023. Nuon had put a lot of thoughts and effort in developing what they call community wealth building, which really resonates with some of those social foundation elements that we have as part of the donut. And they continue to evolve and explore those donut principles without necessarily calling donut economics, without having to talk about it in that way. And their most recent strategy is called Just Transition, which is nothing more than talking about the needs from the population and the environment and how you can bring those things together. That's great. And again, I guess the only thing missing there is the global element, because I understand is the most challenging, is the one that we don't really know how to start engaging with. But I feel like we desperately need to start kind of tapping into what that means, because, when we talk about climate change and growth and the disparities between the global north and the global south, it's really hard for people to understand that what they do here now has everything to do with what's happening across the globe, because I think because people don't identify themselves in that equation, there is very little action. The easiest example that I can give is you have your phone. That phone needs specific minerals and that needs to be mined from probably somewhere in Chile or Colombia. And that creates not only a massive environmental impact, but has an impact on the local communities and the way they are paid. Or, when we hear about the fast fashion industry and what goes on from a labor perspective and the conditions that people are, sometimes forced to work in those conditions, we see these things and we hear about these things, but we kind of like ignore them a little bit.
Like, what can we do about it?
Yeah, I think that's the problem. We feel that we are too far away from it to have an influence, but we can change the way we consume these things. We can raise awareness. We can be very conscious about the actions that we take, have consequences, and we can take personally the responsibility to do that. I think if we are better at telling stories, bringing those things into a more daily conversation, and then maybe people will start to kind of at least have a second thought about buying something or doing something that is maybe not going to help the planet so much. And sometimes it does kind of create action. So a couple of weeks ago, the French Senate backed a law to regulate ultra fashion giants. And they are doing that through imposing eco taxes, banning ads, all sorts of things. But at the same time, one of the biggest critics about this bill is that it leaves out 90% of the fashion production. So they're just targeting maybe the two top fashion giants, but leaving everyone else out of that equation. So it's like a missed opportunity to start addressing some of those global elements as well. And that's really only the tip of the iceberg. When we start talking about things like food or migration or the finance system in places like London, this is such a prevalent part of our local economy. We have the entire finance sector, which is very globally linked. And we, as a coalition, we acknowledge this. It's part of our portrait in our global lens. But we've been trying to engage with the finance sector as part of the work that we're doing to try to recognize that global dimension. We don't really know what's the answer. We don't really know what is the way that we can do this well and do it well. But we are trying to kind of launch a peer-led learning program to be able to better understand that world and to support change. So trying to gather people who are actually experienced in working within that finance sector to be able for us as a coalition to understand what is our additionality, what can we bring, how can we play a role in moving things to that more regenerative model. I mean, it's all very nascent. There are a lot of people interested, but we don't really know. And in my conversations with Deal, they also acknowledge that the global social lens is one of the hardest ones to tackle. And we are still, I guess, exploring and learning by doing a little bit in that space.
Thank you so much for the great chat so far. Is there anything else that either or both of you would like to add?
Maybe I can start. I just wanted to talk a bit more about the coalition and what we're planning. And so if other people want to get involved, please reach out. We really spent a lot of time trying to understand why we exist and what do we want to achieve. And we came up with, 3 main things. So we want to influence decision makers to be able to increase the number of decision makers in London working towards meeting society needs within the planet's limits. We want to change the narrative, to shape the stories which generate enthusiasm around kind of this re-evaluation of economic success. And we want to kind of co-create real world change. So working with other people who are, having great ideas and putting that into practice. The first one, which is kind of changing or influencing decision makers, is trying to kind of build on that work with the public sector, the politicians and those in power to be able to kind of push that regenerative growth and holistic understanding of a place. And, at the moment, we have sometimes requests from local authorities to learn a bit more about the concept. So we go there, we do some workshops, we present the concepts in more detail and what that means. It would be amazing if we could do that for all the 33 boroughs and kind of help to kind of push that boundary a bit more. The second one is to really nail that communication point, to understand the nuances of the language, to be able to reach more people, to keep them engaged over time, and to kind of understand what resonates with people, and to bring that entitlement so everyone feels like they can talk about the economy, and empowering them to see that we are the economy. All of us. And then the last point is really about trying to demonstrate some of that on the ground. So I mentioned the neighborhood pilots that we are working with. We were also developing a safe and ecological high street, which is kind of an exploratory toolkit using the principles of the donut to enable anyone to assess their local high street. And this could be a tool that could support the councils, but community organizations, local people, to reimagine the role of the high street, to collect data in a different way, to empower people, to inform local planning, and so on. So we've been prototyping and piloting this in Walworth as well. Those are the three things that we as a coalition are focusing at the moment. But we are more than happy to explore other things and to have people coming to us with great ideas so we can kind of take this to the next level as well.
Thanks both so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure, and hopefully someone will get in touch. And to our listeners, thanks again for tuning in one more time. We have socials. We are on Instagram, LinkedIn, and TikTok, and we also have a newsletter, so do sign up, and see you next week.